Cool. Why don't we go ahead and jump in and welcome everyone. My name is Dan Callahan. I'm a principal here at ZoomRx, and today I'll be sharing some thought leadership content on HCP targeting strategies. And this content is drawn from ZoomRx's brand builder solution and our FICURE strategic framework for successful pharmaceutical brands, and also touch a little bit on brand builder and FICURE throughout the conversation. So the goal of this webinar is to help us as insights professionals move from insight to impact. And this is the second in a 7-part series where we'll touch on all 7 of the dimensions of FICURE. And obviously today is going to focus in on HCP targeting. In terms of agenda, we'll do a quick welcome and introduction. I will tell you a little bit about FICURE and Brand Builder. We'll talk a little bit about HCP targeting solutions, tools, and ZoomRx's perspective on HCP targeting. We'll talk a little bit about FICURE and our beta tool, and leave some time at the end for Q&A. So in terms of myself, as I mentioned, I am a principal here at ZoomRx. I lead our launch insights practice. Have been around in the industry for a number of years, have worked on a number of projects and launches, and all of this content is drawn from my experience and the experience of my colleagues. As I mentioned, today's content is drawn from our Brand Builder solution, and Brand Builder is our solution for optimizing pharmaceutical brands, and it's a tech-driven insight solution, always grounded in ZoomRx's proprietary technology, our community, our AI solutions, and Brand Builder is always customized for the unique needs of every brand that we're working on. This roadmap is always customized based on a client's budget and their timelines, and it's always driven by brand strategy. And FICURE is our strategic framework for successful pharmaceutical brands, and that's the framework that we're going to be drawing on today. In terms of FICURE, FICURE is an acronym, PHYCURE, and it's an acronym for the 7 dimensions of a successful pharmaceutical brand. Today, we're going to be focusing in on the HCP target component of FICURE, or the H, but just to give a quick overview of the other dimensions, P would be patient target, understanding what characteristics identify patients who are good candidates for a brand. H, which we'll talk about today, which is HCP target, and those characteristics that identify physicians who are most likely to prescribe in higher volumes. Y is the yes journey in terms of the decision milestones and the influencers that shape behavioral prescribing and compliance decisions. C being that competitive landscape and other treatments that target physicians consider when prescribing for target patients. U is unmet needs, looking at the functional emotional needs that are not sufficiently met by competitors, R being rational benefits and those functional and clinical outcomes that are most relevant for patients and physicians. And lastly, E, emotional benefits, those higher order emotional benefits that the clinical and rational benefits deliver to patients and physicians. And this FICURE framework, our perspective at ZoomRx is that if a brand team can answer all 7 of these questions with confidence and with clarity, that tends to lead to more successful brands. But today we're going to be focusing in on the H, or the HCP target components of FICURE. And the key question that we're going to be exploring today is, how can we as insights professionals be more effective in answering this key question of what are those characteristics that identify physicians that are most likely to prescribe in higher volumes, or those higher decile physicians? And this question of HCP targeting, it really runs through a number of common research projects that we're often executing, right? So very early on, opportunity assessment, who are those prescribers? Who's going to prescribe in highest volume? Patient journey, what HCP specialties are physicians, what HCP specialties are patients interacting with throughout the journey? HCP segmentation, What are those segments that tend to see the largest numbers of target patients? Prescribing process for target physicians, what does that prescribing process look like? Brand positioning, brand narrative, what are those most compelling positioning territories, messages, and creative that are unique and differentiating for the product? ATU, which of those messages drive brand perceptions and prescribing decisions and promotional effectiveness? And these are all projects, all types of research that we as insights professionals often touch on. And you can see how that central question of HCP targeting, who is our HCP target, how that runs through so much of the work that we do. So today we'll talk about defining HCP target in 3 different buckets. And it's our perspective at ZoomRx that it's really important to identify, when we're talking about HCP targeting, to define the whys. And that why of HCP targeting tends to fall into 3 categories of, is this an audience stratification question? Is this a promotional optimization question, or is this a growth roadmap question? And defining the target patient is important in all 3 of those, and we'll talk about all 3 of them throughout today's conversation. So starting with the first one, in terms of stratifying and prioritizing the HCP audience, as we're working with brand teams, we see time and time again these themes in their strategic imperatives for their brands that all circle back to stratifying and prioritizing the HCP audience, right? Because it's important to identify those higher opportunity HCPs that are both likely to prescribe and also see a larger number of patients, to that strategic imperative of not just identifying who those physicians are, but also understanding the prescribing drivers, both rationally and emotionally, that are driving the higher usage. And 3, how do we as marketers reach and connect with those higher value HCP audiences? And it's not just about reaching them, it's also about connecting. It's about breaking through the clutter, knowing that our physician audiences are quite busy. And so how do we not just target them with messaging, but also reach through and connect with them with our messaging? And so that theme of stratifying and prioritizing audiences, we often see it in strategic imperatives in the brands that we're working on. And as insights professionals, one of the core tools that we have at our disposal is obviously segmentation. And it's our perspective at ZoomRx that good segmentation best practices, kind of 3 core best practices. One is profiling physicians, profiling our target audience across a blend of behaviors, demographics, and attitudes. Obviously, the behaviors, that's what we're most interested in. At the end of the day, we're most interested in prescribing behaviors, but to the extent that we can then layer in demographics, it helps us from a targeting standpoint. When we can layer in attitudes, it helps us understand the whys behind those behaviors. And so we advocate for a multidimensional approach that combines behaviors, demographics, and attitudes. 2 is identifying real segments. And by real, what we mean is that the segments are not just a statistical artifact. Often we see in segmentation that the stats might point to a particular segmentation solution, but the segments, the physician archetypes within those segments are not necessarily intuitive to the teams, to the marketing team, to the brand team, or to the reps that might be using the segmentation profiles. And it's just really important that the segments are intuitive for the team, that they understand who these physicians are, and that they're consistent with real world archetypes that the team interacts with or team sees as they are promoting a product. And 3, that a segmentation is actionable, that the segments are discrete, and those discrete differences lead to actionable differences in promotional tactics, that it's a meaningful difference among the segments and not just an abstract theoretical difference that isn't necessarily going to lead to differences in promotional tactics. So a couple of best practices on segmentation. In terms of tools, especially when we think about that multi-dimensional profiling, a handy tool is just having a segmentation blueprint that helps us structure those dimensions. And so we generally think about that profiling, that blueprint across 6 dimensions. Again, behaviors, prescribing behaviors being the most important, understanding what they're prescribing. Volume is likelihood to prescribe new therapies, likelihood to prescribe the target therapy, and just their role in prescribing decisions. And then beginning to layer on the attitudes, the whys behind those prescribing behaviors, right? So attitudes like their expertise or their confidence, or whether they're a key opinion leader, what their treatment goals or treatment outcomes are, the degree of patient engagement, their emotional needs. And then tying that together into decision drivers, looking at the relationship between behaviors and attitudes to understand what is driving prescribing patterns. And from a messaging standpoint, what are those perceptions or messages of a particular brand that tends to be most impactful in driving prescribing decisions. 4 is the patient population and really understanding not just who the physician is, but who the patients are that that physician is treating. And those would be things like the patient volume within an indication, and also just the volume, the number of target patients that they're seeing, because of course, they're not necessarily going to prescribe to every patient with an indication. Often they're prescribing to a more narrow set of target patients. 5 is demographics, and these are the classic demographic profiling that helps us identify and reach physicians. And these would be things like practice setting, geographic location, age, and so forth. And then finally, information consumption is understanding how to influence our target physicians, how to influence different personas. And those would be dimensions such as rep influence, media consumption behaviors. And that just helps us from a tactical standpoint and execution standpoint to know which channels, which messages are most likely to reach and ultimately influence different segments. But having this blueprint in place can really help us accomplish that goal of a multi-dimensional segmentation. So one of the other tools that we found valuable is pulling the segments, pulling those HCP personas through in the organization, particularly the sales force. And I think we've all seen segmentations that are very robust. We spend a lot of time, we spend a lot of money, we have beautiful analysis, and it's not necessarily actionable. And one of the tools that we've seen to be very successful is providing the sales force with personas, very simplified personas based on the segmentation segments that they can use in their day-to-day selling. And those personas help the reps to really customize their detailing in terms of unique drivers or unique messages that they want to highlight during the detail, customizing a detail flow, anticipating FAQs, and so forth. And so the classic example is that some segments, some personas of HCPs really emphasize mechanism of action during a detail. Others are very efficacy oriented. And if a rep knows how to identify a MOA centric versus an efficacy centric physician, they can then focus in on MOA messaging versus efficacy messaging. They can customize the detail flow to maybe start with MOA rather than efficacy. They know that there's going to be more detailed FAQs on MOA. So it's a good example of how a rep can pull through some of those HCP persona customization in a detail. And the trick to this is that it has to be simple for the reps. We can't give them a complicated typing tool. We want to give them a very quick diagnostic heuristic of 1, 2, maybe 3 questions that they can ask the physician to very quickly classify their persona and ideally, we've seen that integrated into sales training to, again, simplify it for the rep so that they can pull through these HCP personas in their detail execution. So let's move on to that second category of HCP targeting, which is really about optimizing promotional tactics. And we'll talk about two common types of research: messaging, creative concept, and we'll talk about that through the lens of HCP targeting. And at the end of the day, good messaging and good creative begins with clearly defining who the target audience is. And that sounds obvious, but often we see that we kind of run down the path of creating messages or creating creative concepts without clearly identifying who the message is, who the audience is. And so if we look at a simple case study of a broad audience definition, we'll call that all HCPs who treat any indicated patients, versus a more narrow definition of the audience, and we'll call it HCPs who treat 5 or more indicated patients per month, practice in an academic setting, and are early adopters of new treatments. That wide audience versus very narrow audiences, the messages, the creative concepts that might appeal to one audience might not appeal to another. And so it's really important for us, before we go into messaging, before we go into creative concept optimization, to really clearly identify who is that target audience that the messages and the creative really needs to speak to. And so from a messaging standpoint, what are some of the best practices that we want to keep in mind? Is that it's really about not just the messages, it's about the narrative, and the narrative that presents the most compelling and differentiating reasons for target HCPs to consider treatment. So again, good messaging is through the lens of the target patient. And obviously that's about message prioritization, determining which ones are most and least compelling, but also thinking about lexicon. What specific words, what specific phrases tend to be more or less compelling? And how do we help our brand teams shape that lexicon so that physicians are using the language that tends to be more favorable towards our brand? And also narrative flow, right? Is that it's what is the order of messages? What is that coherent narrative to tell the story behind our brands? And so when we think about messaging research, it is a combination of prioritization and lexicon and narrative flow for our target HCP audience. Similarly, creative concept, it's through the lens of our target HCP audience, and just the importance of customizing our success criteria to align with the unique needs of your brand's target audience. And every brand is different. And so your success criteria for creative concepts are going to be different. And it's really important to identify what those success criteria are for your brand, for that target audience. And obviously, as we go into research, evaluating concepts against that success criteria, optimizing the concepts both in terms of headline, imagery, body copy, and so forth, and also giving the creative agency some really high-level guidelines, because of course we know that the concepts that we test in research, the creative agency is going to go out and do a shoot and create custom content for that campaign, and giving the agency some high-level guidelines that they should keep in mind as they're executing on the creative concept. But again, all of that is through the lens of a creative concept that speaks to our target HCP. So let's talk about that third bucket, which is just providing a roadmap for growth. And what we mean by that is identifying not just physicians that are most likely to prescribe today, but also thinking about who's most likely to prescribe in the future, so that there is a roadmap to growth. And that helps inform sales targeting, helps inform sales incentives, and it does help from a lifecycle management standpoint, that we're thinking about how the landscape is going to evolve over the life cycle of a brand. And the key takeaway here is that the brand's target physician should evolve over time. We want it to evolve over time, that the target at launch is going to be different than the target a couple years post-launch, and is going to be hopefully even broader as the brand moves into lifecycle management. And it's important for us as insights professionals to not just think about who the target physician is today, but who the target physician is going to be in the future and how it might evolve. And so a tool that can help with that is having a lifecycle growth plan that stretches our segmentation, our HCP personas out over time. And so at launch, you might have a focus on loyalists. Further out from launch, 2 to 3 years out from launch, the goal is really to maintain those loyalists and to grow the dabblers, and even further out, continue to drive growth through this lower tier persona of trialists. And why is that? A number of reasons. Number one, at launch, we often see saturation, right, of that target audience of physician. At some point, it's not uncommon that they have prescribed to as many patients as they have, and it's important to begin to move down into these second and third tier HCPs to drive growth. Two is that inevitably prescribing patterns change over time, and the strategic intent is to move physicians through that funnel of loyalists to dabblers, sorry, non-users to trialists to dabblers to loyalists. And inevitably, as prescribing patterns change over time, we want our physician targeting strategies to evolve with it. And lastly, the landscape is going to change. There's going to be new competitive entrants. There's going to be likely new data for your brand. And as the landscape changes, prescribing patterns, treatment attitudes, those will evolve, and our physician segments will evolve as well. So to bring things back into focus, 3 key objectives of HCP targeting, and to keep these objectives in mind as we're executing research. And one is efficient resource allocation, making sure that we are targeting the right physicians with the right messages and using our limited resources intelligently. 2 is having a roadmap for future growth. And 3 is focusing our promotional strategies on that target position. So that largely brings us to a close in terms of our prepared content. Let me pause here and feel free to drop any questions into the chat. I will pick them up and happy to answer any questions that you might have. Okay. Well, I don't see any questions coming in. And to get us wrapped up, we did want to invite all of our participants to participate in our beta test for our FICURE tool. And so the FICURE framework that I previewed earlier is a great tool for insights professionals to identify what the organization knows today, to develop hypotheses across the 7 dimensions, to identify gaps and questions to answer that you can then pull into designing a research plan for your team. And so we're developing a tool to help insights professionals, to help brand teams in developing these hypotheses, in identifying key questions to answer across our 7 FICURE dimensions. If you're interested in participating in the beta, let us know. We're eager to find beta testers. We're really excited about the tool and would love to find some willing partners. And here's my contact. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, we'd love to hear from you. And of course, if you are interested in participating in the FICURE beta tool, let me know that as well. I can be reached at dan.callahan@zoomrx.com. And otherwise, I'll just check just to make sure that we don't have any other questions. I don't see any other questions coming in. And so we'll get wrapped up. Thank you all so much for joining. Hope everyone has a great afternoon and look forward to keeping in touch with all of you.